So for our next session, we've got an exciting session on 3D Gaussian Splatting as we explore how this transformative technique for high-fidelity scene reconstruction is used in physical AI. Please welcome Nick Schneider, Engineering Manager of Neural Rendering at NVIDIA, to the stage.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm Nick. I'm leading a team at NVIDIA that brings all of the great research that NVIDIA has on neural reconstruction into Omniverse NuRec. And today I'm talking about how Gaussians have, within just 2 years, become a key technology in enabling physical AI by providing highly realistic simulations for everyone. Gaussian splatting is a method that belongs to the family of neural reconstruction technologies. And as an input, neural reconstruction gets sparse observations from a scene, which are then used to train a neural reconstruction model. We can then query this model for novel views, which allows us, in this example, to render 360-degree views of that scene. For robotic applications, this is a key feature, actually, as we can now simulate novel camera paths, but it also allows us to test different sensors or other viewpoint angles from the cameras. To understand how we can train such a model, we first need to understand how Gaussians work. And for that, I would like to share a small story from a recent weekend I had with my family. So I was sitting in the garden with them, and they were asking me, Dad, what are you actually doing for work? And I said, that's tough to explain. But I tried to do it in a very simple way. So let's imagine you would paint a picture of where you're sitting right now. But instead of doing that with a pen and a canvas, you draw a picture using balloons. So basically, you would attach a set of balloons at some nails that are placed on a wooden board. And you would use different shapes and colors for the balloons. So if you put up enough balloons, you would end up with a nice picture which could roughly represent the grass and sky as seen from your perspective. And my son was actually very eager to try that directly. So he was putting up the balloons, and after a while he was like, wow, Dad, that's exhausting, actually. And I said, yeah, right? So congratulations, you just figured out that putting up a lot of balloons takes a lot of runtime. So we looked at the 4 balloons, and now he said, but that's still pretty far from being a good picture. And I said, yeah, that's another important point, right? For good reconstruction, we need a lot of balloons. So yeah, we kind of kept doing that. And at one point, he was, oh, we are running out of nails, Dad. And I said, yeah, that's another important aspect. You just realize what it is like running out of GPU memory. So we looked at our balloons, and my son was very happy with it. But I said to him, well, this looks great now from your perspective, but my perspective looks completely different. And where you just put your blue balloon, for example, in my perspective, there's the house. So I would also go and try to rearrange the balloons together with him to optimize the set of balloons for both his and my view. And this, I said, is what we call optimization. So in a very simplistic way, this is what Gaussian splatting does. Instead of balloons, we're trying to optimize the positions, scale, color, and rotation of Gaussians to then project them later onto the rendered image, right? We use the actual image to calculate then a loss, which is backpropagated to the Gaussians. And the original paper was actually introduced here at SIGGRAPH in 2023. So how has the world changed since then? 2 key papers from NVIDIA that enabled Gaussian splatting for a broader range of applications are 3D Gaussian ray tracing and 3D Gaussian uncentered transform. 3D Gaussian ray tracing introduced ray tracing to Gaussians, and with that enabled secondary lighting, nonlinear camera models, such as fisheye camera, and also compensated rolling shutter effects. However, training and rendering time was quite impacted by that. So 3D GUT introduced a hybrid approach where splatting is used to determine the rays that are used for tracing. This was done via sigma points, as you might know them from the unscented Kalman filter, hence also the name. And these sigma points are cleverly selected to approximate the actual distribution of the Gaussian. This now allows you to use nonlinear camera models and consider rolling shutter in the splatting process. In comparison, 3D GUT achieves slightly above state-of-the-art results for the reconstruction quality and rendering in comparison to the original paper, and it's only slightly slower in the reconstruction time. But the key benefit, as I mentioned earlier, is that this enables now support for distorted, nonlinear camera models. And this is actually a key enabler for many robotic platforms that come with a variety of cameras and different lenses, such as fisheye cameras. In this comparison video, you can see that Gaussian splatting in the middle has a higher fidelity than the nerve reconstructions on the left. The difference between the standard Gaussian splatting implementation and 3D GUT becomes more apparent when the vehicle takes a right turn. Here you can now see that the original implementation does not consider the rolling shutter effect of the recorded camera, causing really blurred reconstructions here. The code of both 3D-GRT and 3D-GUT is made publicly available on GitHub. Please check it out and reconstruct your own real-world scene. This allows you really to bring everything into simulation, so you can imagine scanning your living room or a neighborhood street, and then put that later into Omniverse and Isaac Sim. 3D-GUT allows us to bring the real world into simulation, and with that provide a playground for all kinds of robotic applications. With a set of sparse images and a robotics model, you can now place your robot into a virtual training gym where it can train safely how to interact with the environment. And with the just recently announced Omniverse NuRec, we're bringing this capability now to everyone. So Omniverse NuRec is a set of APIs and libraries to generate interactive 3D simulation from real-world data. It includes reconstruction, rendering, and generative enhancement for high-fidelity real-time simulation environments. For reconstruction, NuRec leverages Gaussian-based methods, which reconstruct scenes into millions of particles that can be moved and manipulated. And this significantly actually speeds up reconstruction times compared to traditional nerve-based methods. For rendering, we add ray tracing to improve the fidelity of the reconstruction using our 3D-GUT rendering algorithm. And finally, we have generative models such as Fixer, I will talk about that later, that fill in reconstruction artifacts for high-quality novel view synthesis. NuRec is actually built on top of a variety of NVIDIA models and accelerated libraries. We leverage, for example, the latest Cosmos World Foundation models to enable generative AI for Gaussian splatting. We'll see some more examples of this later in the talk. On top of the models, we also use NVIDIA accelerated libraries to really squeeze the last bit of performance out of the GPU. So how does a typical workflow with NuRec look like? At the very core is the sensor data of the robotic platform. You have to imagine, like, this can be any autonomous vehicle platform. It can be a robot or autonomous vehicle. And the very first step is to make sure that the input data into the reconstruction pipeline is really good. So we have Encore at the very first stage. It comes with a set of libraries and tools that makes sure the data quality is right at the input. And this is really one of the key steps here, because the quality of your reconstruction can only be as good as the quality of your input data. The next step is tuning the real-world data into a high-fidelity reconstruction. And at the core of this is, as I mentioned before, 3D-GUT. But NuRec actually extends that with domain-specific enhancement, for example, automotive applications. And then at the very top, you can see Fixer, which allows us to refine the reconstructions either directly during training or after rendering. So we can have it as a post-processing step then. The NuRec Asset Harvester allows us to extract objects as Gaussian splats from a scene. And this allows you later to build your own asset libraries with Gaussians, extract really everything from vehicles to pedestrians as assets, and place them later back into the scenarios. The NuRec reconstruction output is stored as USD, and from there it can later be loaded for rendering via Omniverse or via gRPC servers that allow you to communicate directly with any simulation environment. And this last part is the one that is actually most relevant for your simulation, right? So you can now ask NuRec to render a novel view, use that as an input into your robotic application, react based on those inputs, generate a novel path, ask NuRec again to create the next frame, and then this continues in a loop. Gaussian splatting is limited by the observation we provide during training, especially generalizing to novel views, such as in this example, rendering a view from a completely new position is very tough and results in artifacts which can affect the robotic applications. So here in this example, we, for example, shifted from the original recording by 1 lane, and this shift has never been observed in the data. So it's very tough actually to then reconstruct that scene when you have never seen it before in your input data. So NuRec Fixer is a model that enhances the reconstructions, and with that, it allows us to create much cleaner renderings. The base of Fixer is the Cosmos World Foundation model, which leverages knowledge from millions of physical grounded drives. So we can then fill those holes in the observation and enhance the reconstruction fidelity significantly. Another NuRec extension that leverages generative AI is Asset Harvester. I really do love that video. Might make you a bit mad, but so Asset Harvester generates novel views of objects using a diffusion model and then uses a transformer to estimate Gaussians from that. And with that, we can now build large libraries of different vehicle assets for driving applications, which can later be used to generate novel scenarios by adding and replacing vehicles or changing their trajectories. Looking at the video, you might see, like, we have only observed some of those vehicles from one side only, right? But the generative AI allows us really to take also the perspective from the other side, and that allows us to have a complete view of that vehicle. And that is so important if you go, again, like want to render novel views, we have Fixer to help that, but we also have Asset Harvester that allows us to really complete the shapes of the assets. NVIDIA uses USD as a way to store the Gaussian data. Currently, there is no industry standard for Gaussians, and the field is still evolving very rapidly, which makes standardization really challenging. When talking about a standard, it is really important to consider that if it is too rigid, innovation might become very slow. And there's still a lot of innovation going on, I think, especially looking at this conference right now. We've seen so many Gaussian splatting papers. Some use MLPs in between, right? It's a very complex and very quickly emerging field where we have to really be careful if we define a standard not to slow that down. If it is too loose, however, there's really no point in having a standard. So at this point, we really believe that extensibility is the key to a good standard, and we're looking forward to working with the community to define a suitable standard there. Why are we already talking about standardization then? Well, the fact is that many industrial partners are already using Gaussian splatting and in their applications today. So we've seen autonomous taxis in San Francisco, Phoenix, Austin, LA, and other cities, right? But scaling autonomous driving safely to the whole world requires to be able to navigate safely in basically any scenario. And realistic simulation is a key enabler for AV to test millions of scenarios before going out into real traffic. The videos you see here are from our internal AV simulator, which is already generating and rendering a large set of NuRec reconstructions daily. A major milestone I would also like to announce here is that we have just enabled Omniverse NuRec rendering in color. This allows any developer to test now AV applications in simulation on real-world Gaussian splatting data. We've reconstructed over 80 different driving scenes and encourage the community really to engage with those and use it for replay-based testing. Similarly to Kala, we also just announced Isaac Sim 5, and it comes integrated with NuRec. So using the publicly available 3D GOT repository, as I described earlier, you can now record any real-world environment and turn it into a simulation where you can place a robot now and let it interact with the environment. You could also see in the videos that it is possible to, let me replay that. yeah, you can see in the video also here in the middle that it's now also possible to place objects into simulation, which allows the robots to interact and make sure not to to avoid those objects in simulation. And on the very right, you can also see a very new work actually where we interact with Gaussians and we can manipulate those. Yeah, so just recently we have announced further research on Gaussians, such as Gen AI relighting of assets. This allows you to replay a real-world drive at dusk, dawn, or night. And by adding physics materials to Gaussians, we enable robots to manipulate Gaussians and thus interact with the objects. Further, we have work that really enables large-scale scene reconstructions, which allows you to rebuild complete cities, right? So you really, when I talked about NuRec earlier, we were talking about AV applications that typically are a much smaller scale. But with this new research, we can really scale out and rebuild whole environments with that. And finally, we also have a Cosmos model that allows you to generate basically any environment from text and represent it as Gaussians, and then allows you to place robots into that scene and interact with that environment. We're really looking forward to enable those with NuRec to enable further physical AI development in the future. Yeah, so finally, I really want to encourage every one of you to test this out. Go to the GitHub page of 3DGRUT, bring your own living room or your neighborhood road into simulation, and then test it together with Fixer, Incala, or i6Sim. All those tools are publicly available, and I'm really looking forward to more exciting research in this direction. Thank you all.
We do have time for questions, so please raise your hand and we will pass a mic to you if you have a question. Oh,
have you ever tried to...
Oh, hold on 1 second. There's a mic right next to you.
Mic
I'm
is
so
coming
loud,
up.
I really don't need it. Have you ever tried to transform a volumetric data set from like a medical data set, like a stacked set of clinical data, into a Gaussian splat? Has that been tried before?
I personally haven't done that, but it's definitely possible. So what I'm presenting right now is really, the goal is to bring the real world into simulation. So you can imagine you could just use like a cell phone camera and just go into a medical environment and really capture that and transform it into Gaussians. And that lets you then interact with that.
Because like the current state of the art, like what people currently do with medical, if you want to have like a volume stack, let's say you want to look at an organ, you have a stack of data, and then you can extract, a kidney or something like that, and it's typically aliased. But I'm just curious. But it sounds like it's like mostly camera captured, but it'd be interesting to have volume data transformed.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. It's interesting research direction that I have not yet dealt with so far.
Let's talk.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. Yeah, cool.
Thank you. On one of the slides, you showed the USD to a NuRec sort of connection. Is that through a file format plugin of some sorts? And if so, is that available with Omniverse already?
Yes, you can look it up on Omniverse. We described the format, and you can see how it looks like. Currently, as you can see here in this image, there's an NVIDIA logo, which means this is a custom format that we have on top of USD, which doesn't make it possible to actually interact with other simulations right now. And this is exactly where we need to work together to have a standard there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You get a lot of depth data from this, and you're talking about processing the visual data and cleaning it up from another point of view. I'm just curious how the depth works into the training and cleaning sort of the actual sort of geometry up, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So we use geometry. We use 3D data if it's available. So we have the possibility to also use LiDAR data as an input into the reconstruction. And that does help actually for novel views because you have a geometric prior that you can then use to reconstruct the scenes. We also use regularization techniques to, for example, because we know it's a ground, right? We know from segmentations that this is a ground, it has to be flat. Still, it is very challenging because the model is not constrained to do anything like enough in that respect. So going to novel views is really one of the most challenging things. And I do think there's still a lot of research possibility ahead for that. And we can use generative models for that, right? We don't need to just use the data that we have from that one drive to reconstruct a scene. We have knowledge how driving scenes look like from millions of data that we collected already. So why not leverage that? And this is where the generative models come in to help us actually make that better.
Hi there. I just wanted to understand, like when you spoke about robotics and its applications, since the Gaussian splat is kind of like a volumetric scenario, and when you have like tessellated triangles everywhere, like how is that like replicated in terms of like, interactions with the robot and the environment?
So your question is if I have like floating Gaussians in my simulation, how we interact with those?
Yes. Like, what are the control points then? Like what is the surface? There is no surface then, right? It's just a bunch of gas. What are you interacting with? Right.
Yeah. So actually, we typically do this with a combination of meshes and Gaussian data. So the mesh is actually to constrain like where the robot can drive, but the Gaussians give you the visual input that lets you control like based on what you see, right? So it typically comes with a combination of a mesh. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick, for diving into the latest in 3D Gaussian splatting and physical AI.
Thank you.